You're alone on Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. The ice sheet beneath your feet has broken away from shore, and you're slowly drifting into the void. The bone-chilling water below means certain death if you try to swim, and with each passing minute, the gap between you and safety grows wider. This was the nightmare that Louis Sweet faced in 1929 during one of Michigan's harshest winters on record. Armed with nothing but an axe and a frozen lake trout, he would endure an ordeal that would test the very limits of human endurance. Louis Sweet wasn't just any ice fisherman. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who knew Lake Michigan's moods intimately. Living in Allenson, Michigan, about 30 miles from where our story unfolds, Sweet was a part of a hardy breed of men who ventured onto the frozen lake each winter in pursuit of the prized lake trout, or lakers as they called them. The morning of Tuesday, January 22nd, 1929, began like any other for Sweet and his two fellow fishermen. They parked their cars beside Lake Michigan's frozen shore and made their familiar trek across the rock-strewn snowy beach of Crane Island. Their destination lay a mile offshore, the Crane Island fishing grounds, positioned west of Waugashan's Point, off the northwest portion of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. This remote corner of Michigan was a world unto itself. Waugashan's Point stretched out into the lake like a long and narrow tongue of sand, sparsely wooded and completely wild. No roads carved through its wilderness, and both the point and Crane Islands stood uninhabited, making them perfect for the solitary pursuit of ice fishing. The three men had each constructed their own dark houses, small shed-like structures built to shield them from the brutal elements. These wooden shelters were clustered together about a mile from shore, each one a testament to the hardy nature of Michigan's ice fishermen. Inside, the small stoves provided warmth as the men pursued their quarry below the ice. Their fishing method was far different from what we know today. Instead of traditional rods and reels, these men employed a technique passed down through generations. They used hookless wooden decoys, carefully carved to mimic prey fish, to coax the massive lake trout to the surface. When a fish came within range, they would strike with a heavy 7-tined spear connected to a 50-foot line that was attached to their dark house's roof. On good days, each man might haul in 4 or 5 lake trout before heading home. The morning passed slowly, with few fish showing interest in decoys. The sky hung gray and threatening, while stiff winds whipped across the frozen surface. Just before noon, Sweet finally saw his chance. A heavy lake trout emerged from the depths, its shadowy form gliding beneath his ice hole. With practiced precision, Sweet manipulated his wooden decoy, teasing the wary predator closer. When the moment was perfect, he thrust the spear downward, feeling the satisfying strike as the tines found their mark. The wounded fish dove deep, the line playing out as Sweet waited patiently for the struggle to subside. Finally, he hauled his prize onto the ice inside his dark house. It was a while admiring his catch that the first serious warning came. A massive gust of wind rumbled across the lake with such force that it threatened to topple the dark houses. Sweet's companions, sensing the danger in the shifting weather, decided to head for shore. They urged him to join them, warning that the wind had shifted to the northeast. Sweet made the fateful decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Be alright for a spell," he said, unsatisfied with just one fish. "The ice will hold unless it blows harder than this." His friends departed, leaving him alone on the vast frozen expanse. 30 minutes later, Sweet heard a sound that would forever change his life. A reverberating crack, followed by a sickening grinding noise that shook his dark house to its foundation. The ice mass was fracturing, grabbing only his axe and his hard-worn lake trout. Sweet burst out of his shelter and began sprinting toward the Crane Island, nearly a mile away. The first half of his run was treacherous but manageable. Then halfway to shore, his heart sank. A narrow vein of black water had appeared, zigzagging across the wide field of ice. The crack was only 10 feet wide, and he reached it, but it was growing wider with terrifying speed. Sweet faced an impossible choice: attempt to swim across the frigid water and risk almost certain death from hypothermia, or stay on the drifting ice and hope for rescue. Even if he managed to swim across without going into shock, pulling himself up onto the slick ice on the other side would be nearly impossible. The decision was made for him as the gap widened to 20 feet, then 90. Through the swirling snow, he could barely see the other side. With no other option, Sweet turned back toward his dark house, but his ordeal was only the beginning. Knowing that his dark house might become a death trap if the ice split beneath it, Sweet began building a crude wall of snow in the center of the ice floe for protection against the howling wind. As he worked, A sharp crack like a pistol rang out across the ice. He looked up to see his dark house splitting apart and disappearing into the black water below. Within half an hour, his companions' abandoned shelters met the same fate. Sweet was now completely exposed to the elements with nothing but his makeshift snow wall between him and the bitter cold. The ice floe he stood on was massive, approximately 2 miles across and 2 feet thick, but he knew it wouldn't stay intact forever. As darkness fell, the storm intensified into a full blizzard. Throughout that first night, Sweet fought desperately against the cold and fatigue. He would rest briefly behind his snow wall, then force himself to get up and run back and forth across the ice to keep his blood flowing. He knew that if he fell asleep, he would never wake up. The wind-driven snow cut his face like a whiplash, and the cold seemed to penetrate his very bones. As Wednesday dawned, Sweet found himself drifting near the abandoned Waugason's lighthouse. For a brief hopeful moment, it looked like the ice floe would ground against it, offering him a chance at survival, but the current shifted slightly, carrying him past the structure, just 100 yards away, close enough to see salvation, but too far to reach it. What Sweet didn't know was that back on shore, his friends had raised the alarm, and one of the largest searches in Michigan history was being organized. The word of his dramatic plight had flashed across the telegraph wires to downstate cities across the nation. Millions sat in their warm houses, wondering about the fate of the lone fisherman adrift on Lake Michigan. However, the search was initially hampered by the continuing storm. It wasn't until Wednesday afternoon that conditions improved enough for the Coast Guard vessels and aircraft to begin their systematic search of nearly 2,000 square miles of lake surface. Police officers, firemen, and local volunteers trudged up and down the shoreline, searching for any sign of the missing ice fisherman. By Thursday morning, after almost 2 full days on the ice, fate finally showed Sweet some mercy. His ice floe crashed into White Shoal's Light, a lonely lighthouse rising from a concrete crib in the middle of the lake. The collision was violent. The edge of the ice rose out of the water, curled back upon itself, and came crashing down in an avalanche of massive blocks. But reaching the lighthouse proved to be another challenge entirely. The entire structure was encased in ice a foot thick, with only a steel ladder offering access to the door 22 feet above. For 3 grueling hours, Sweet chopped at the ice with his axe, freeing one rung at a time. His hands and feet were severely frozen, making each swing of the axe more difficult than the last one. When his strength finally gave out, just 3 ranks from the top, Sweet refused to give up. Using blocks of ice from the shattered floe, he constructed an ingenious ramp to the lighthouse door. After another 3 hours of the back-breaking work, he finally dragged himself inside, more dead than alive. Inside White Shoal's Light, Sweet discovered what seemed like a paradise after his ordeal. Bacon, rice, dried fruit, flour, tea, and 3 small kerosene stoves with plenty of fuel. His feet were so badly frozen that he had to cut off his shoes with a dull knife that he found in the lighthouse. After thawing his extremities as best as he could over one of the oil stoves, he collapsed into the nearest bed, sleeping for nearly 24 hours straight. When he woke up on Thursday morning, Sweet could see the timbered shore of the lake, both to the north and south, through the lighthouse windows. The sight was both tantalizing and cruel. Safety lay just 12 miles away, but between him and land stretched a deadly patchwork of ice fields, separated by channels of the frigid water. That afternoon, Sweet heard the drone of an approaching aircraft. His heart leaped. Surely this was his chance for rescue, but the lighthouse windows were covered with heavy screens to protect them from storms, making it impossible to signal through them. The door opening to the crib was several flights below his living quarters, and there was no time to reach it. Sweet made a desperate attempt to climb to the lens room at the top of the tower, but by the time he reached it, the plane had already completed its single pass and was disappearing into the distance. Later that day, another aircraft flew by, but Sweet, hobbled by his injured feet, could only watch helplessly from behind the screen windows as it vanished over the horizon. That night, Sweet attempted to signal the mainland. He fashioned a crud flare from oil-soaked rags attached to a length of wire and ventured onto the lighthouse's icy gallery to swing it back and forth. In the distance, he could see the lights of Cross Village winking from their high bluff, but his makeshift beacon went unnoticed. By Sunday morning, after 5 days since his ordeal began, Sweet knew he had to make a decision. His feet were in terrible condition, with blisters constantly forming and requiring drainage. The new ice that had formed overnight looked solid enough to bear his weight, and he knew this might be his only chance at survival. In another day or two, he would not be able to walk at all. Unable to wear shoes on his swollen feet, Sweet put on 3 pairs of heavy woolen socks that he'd found in the lighthouse. He gathered his 2 constant companions, the axe that had saved his life, and the frozen lake trout that he caught what seemed like a lifetime ago. These items had become symbols of his determination to survive, and he refused to leave them behind. But what followed was one of the most remarkable feats of human endurance ever recorded. Sweet began his painful journey across the ice towards shore, knowing that any wrong step could send him plunging into the freezing water. His progress was agonizingly slow. He would take a few steps, then sit and rest, then force himself to continue. Often, he had to crawl on his hands and knees, with the frozen surface tearing at his clothes. Late that afternoon, he passed the western tip of Crane Island, near where his ordeal had begun, but he didn't want to stop there, knowing that Cross Village, with its population and possibility of medical help, was his best chance at survival. As darkness approached, Sweet discovered an abandoned sportsman's shack about 5 miles from his destination. Inside, he found coffee grounds and a tin of frozen milk, but was too exhausted to cook his still preserved lake trout. The coffee he managed to make revived him briefly, but by morning he was violently ill, possibly from the frozen milk. Unable to move on Monday due to severe illness, Sweet lay in the shack for an entire day and night, slipping in and out of consciousness. By now, he'd been missing for nearly a week, and most people assumed that he was dead. The search had been called off days earlier, but Sweet wasn't finished. On Tuesday morning, almost exactly a week after his ordeal began, he gathered his remaining strength and continued towards Cross Village. Just before noon, he finally stumbled up the steep bluff into town, still clutching his axe and frozen trout. When an elderly resident saw him in the snow-covered street, he initially recoiled at the sight of this emaciated, weathered man covered in tattered rags, but moments later he helped Sweet to his feet and guided him to warmth and safety. Sweet spent 10 weeks in the hospital recovering from his ordeal. The severe frostbite he endured resulted in the amputation of all his fingers and toes, but he had achieved what many thought impossible, surviving 7 days alone on Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. His story made headlines across the country, capturing the public's imagination with its themes of human endurance and the will to survive. Today, Lake Michigan's waters still freeze each winter, and ice fishermen still venture out onto its surface. But the story of Louis Sweet serves as both inspiration and warning, a testament to human resilience and a reminder of nature's awesome power. His journey became more than just a tale of survival. It became a legend of the Great Lakes, proving that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to the sheer determination and will to live. If you enjoyed this incredible story of survival, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave your thoughts in the comments and let me know what survival stories you'd like to hear next. Until next time.